Anyway, you wanted at least 4 minutes to discuss this next movie, so I've given you 7.
Thank you.
Because when you say 4, you mean 7.
I mean 7. Enys Men is the new film by Mark Jenkin,
Spell that.
Okay, so it's spelt Enys Men, so E-N-Y-S-M-E-N.
Thank you.
It's pronounced Enys Men, Main being the derivation of the word men. It's a stone. So Enys Men means Stone Island, okay? Mark Jenkin made Bait. If you remember, he did this on clockwork camera, black and white, that he then developed himself in his studio in Newlyn, and all the sound was post-synced afterwards. Bait went on to become this really sensational success. Won terrific awards, did fabulously well at the box office, considering it cost absolutely nothing at all. Now on BFI Player. And anyway, so this is Mark's next film. In colour, but the same principle. Clockwork camera, all sound post-synced. The best way of describing it is to say that when Mark was first pitching the film, he wanted to call it, he's told this story before, but I'll say it. He said he originally wanted to describe it as a lost Cornish folk horror. And then somebody said to him, well, it's not lost, is it? It's there. And you go, oh, no, well, it's not lost, but it does look like it might have been lost. It looks like a kind of relic from the 1970s that's been a discovered film. He then wasn't certain about the horror thing, because although the trailer is very creepy, it's not really a horror film. It's more of something with a very unsettling atmosphere to it. So you're left with a folk film, which doesn't really mean anything at all. So he ended up with the description of a Cornish film. And actually, I think a Cornish film is probably the best you can get to a description of it. It's very little point in attempting to describe it in terms of plot, but essentially, Mary Woodvine, who is in Bait, is a volunteer on an island off the coast of Cornwall in 1973. The island is uninhabited, and she is there, and she has a daily ritual, which is that she walks the cliffs, she takes temperature readings in the ground among a rare outcrop of flowers, very rare outcrop of flowers. She walks back home, she drops a stone down a mine shaft, and she listens to it fall. She goes back to the cottage that she lives. She starts up the generator, which is running short on fuel. She makes tea. She's running short on tea. She's waiting for supplies to come in. Her only real connection with the outside world is through radios, whether it's a transmitter or through a transistor radio. And then at night, she reads this book, which is a book from the 1970s called A Blueprint for Survival, which has got a thing on the front cover of it, it's a quote about the book, which says, after reading this book, nothing will seem the same anymore. And I think the same could be said of the film. Then what happens is that past, present, and future all start to intertwine, all in the shadow of this standing stone, the stone of the title. Standing stones, as anyone who's interested in sort of, folklore and local history will know, are very, very powerful images of the past, and they're often thought to be, kind of almost living, breathing entities. And the standing stone is there looking out to sea, and there are stories of tragedies at seas and loss at sea. There's all this stuff going on under the ground, which is the history of mining. And then there is the world that she's living in which past, present, and future all seem to be colliding. I'm going to play you a clip which I think gives you a sense of the atmosphere. Here is a clip from Enys Men.
You really needed the visuals on that one, I think.
That's one of the few scenes in which there is somebody else in the scene, whether that's Ed Rowe who's coming to bring supplies, but most of the time she's on her own. But as she says, I'm not on my own. When I first saw this, I was so overwhelmed by the atmosphere of it that I was kind of sort of almost unable to describe what the film had felt like immediately after. I saw it in Newlyn, actually, which of course is rather wonderful because obviously it, as I said, that thing about it's a Cornish film and so much of it is to do with the landscape. It's been described by somebody saw it as they said it's a love letter to the landscape, and that is true. But it's a very, very unsettling and yet somehow incredibly vibrant portrait of a land built on industry and built on a relationship between the land and the sea, in which characters seem to be living in an entire thriving history. Now, on one level, it is, it's a horror-inflected movie. When people talk about folk horror, you tend to think of things like, the unholy trilogy of British folk horror, which is, Blood on Satan's Claw and Wicker Man and Witchfinder General. But folk horror is a much more sort of international thing. And folk horror really comes down to any story that is absolutely rooted in the landscape from which the story comes and is rooted in the tradition from which the story comes. I've said before this thing about the more you get into the detail of something, the more universal it makes it. The way to make a story universal isn't to include a whole bunch of stuff which everyone will recognize, but it's basically the more detail you get into, the more you think, okay, this is real, this is authentic, therefore I believe in it. In the case of this, I think Mark Jenkins is genuinely a cinematic artist, and my breath was taken away by Enys Men. I've now seen it 3 times. I'm still not quite sure what's going on. I have some ideas about what it's about. Mark Jenkins solidly refuses to explain the film, and quite rightly so, because what he wants you to do is to respond to it on a very kind of fundamental sort of emotional level, to feel it rather than to analyse it. It looks extraordinary. The colour is wonderful. The reds and the yellows, which are actually a key plot point, are thriving and brilliant. Mary Woodvine is mesmerising. I mean, it's a performance, a lot of which there is very, very little dialogue. It's all to do with watching her face, watching the way that she reacts, watching the way that she watches the landscape around her, and understanding from that what's going on in her head and in the world around her. It has some brilliant use of music. They use Brenda Wooten and the Falling Male Voice Choir singing the Bristol Christ, which is incredibly profound. There's a BFI season on called The Cinematic DNA of Enys Men, which has got all these things like Long Weekend and Haunters of the Deep and Stigma, which are all things that kind of Mark Jenkins is referring to. Many of them are from the 1970s. But it is a film in and of itself that is unlike anything else. I genuinely think he's an artist. I cannot explain to you why it is that Enys Men has got under my skin quite so much. And I am willing to accept that it is a personal thing. You either get this or you don't. It got me on a genetic level. I think it's like a dream of a movie. And I think, following up Bait was always going to be a hard call, but this is just next level wonderful. It's one of my favourite films of the year, and it's only January.
Okay, so that's quite... So, yes, okay. But I think what you mean is it's likely to be one of your favourite movies
of the year.
Even if we spoke in December.
But the thing I would say to everybody is what you have to do is you have to go in with an open mind. You have to let the film cast its spell.
Hopefully at a cinema near you.
Hopefully at a cinema near you.
Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed making it. While you're here, check out all the other videos because they're cool too, aren't they?
Yeah, and if you want to keep up to date with everything Kermode and Mayo's Take, then check out our social channels.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
I mean, I would. I have done.
Excellent.